Hi, and congrats to you for reaching the very last lesson of the unit. So you've done a lot of hard work, and now we are just about at the end. So today we're discussing the carbon cycle. Let's get started. So we'll be asking ourselves what renewable resources exist in the four spheres and what are the non-renewable resources. These are your first question I'm asking you. You should be able to tell me what's there. So what are the renewable resources that exist in the spheres and what are the non-renewable resources? If you want to go ahead and pause the video, now's a good time to do it because you need to have a discussion, create a list, and then check your answers with me. So go ahead and pause the video. Yeah, pause it because I'm moving on. So here are your resources in the four spheres. The renewable ones are geothermal from the lithosphere, hydraulic from the hydrosphere, wind energy from the atmosphere, solar energy also from the atmosphere, non-renewable, we have discussed nuclear from the lithosphere, and fossil fuels, oil, coal, natural gas, also from the lithosphere. Here are all of our resources, where they come from, and whether or not they're renewable or non-renewable. These are the sorts of things that you will be expected to memorize on your final exam. If you want to take a minute and copy down this list somewhere, might be good too. If you're going to do that, pause the video again and give yourself some time because I'm about to get started with today's new stuff. So here are your essential questions for today. What are biological and geological carbon cycles? How do the atmosphere, biosphere, lithosphere, and ocean, so hydrosphere, interact in the carbon cycle? So how do these four spheres interact? Here is your lesson objectives. I can explain the transformation of carbon in the four spheres. So you need to explain how carbon is moved between the four spheres, and I can describe the role of photosynthesis and respiration. So we'll discuss what those are and what they do. All right, let's get started. So the biosphere. The biosphere contains all of the living things on Earth, plants, animals, etc. Plants and animals have a role to play in the movement of carbon between the spheres of the Earth. So plants and animals are involved in that moving of carbon. So here's our carbon cycle. Some basic vocabulary that you need to have before we move on. A cycle. So a cycle is when things happen repeatedly. It's called a cycle. Okay. Carbon, the fourth most abundant element in the universe. So carbon, there's a lot of carbon on the Earth. There's a lot of carbon in the whole universe. It is essential to life on Earth. Okay. And here's different forms of carbon, just as some examples. Gas, carbon dioxide, solid, limestone, wood, diamonds, graphite, so pencil lead, all carbon. Liquid, oil, which is a fossil fuel. All right, let's keep going. So, Earth's carbon cycle. The carbon cycle is a system that transfers carbon from one part of the environment to the other. So basically just moving carbon around. The sun and the heat of Earth's interior provide the energy that drives the cycle. So the sun and also the core of the Earth, okay, are part of this. The geological carbon cycle is the carbon cycle that interacts with the rock cycle, so lithosphere. Okay. Biological carbon cycle is carbon that interacts with living organisms. So we'll see the difference between the two. So the geological carbon cycle is a long-term carbon cycle. It takes millions and millions of years, kind of like the formation of fossil fuels that we've discussed with the lithosphere. Okay, so it interacts through the process of weathering and dissolution. So we'll see later what these are: precipitation of minerals, burial and subduction, volcanic eruptions, and combustion. Okay, so weathering and dissolution. So carbonic acid forms when atmospheric CO2 and water react. So over time, see all these cracks that are forming in the Earth. Water gets into the joints and makes cracks in the rock and that kind of thing. This is part of it. Okay. Weakly acidic water falls as rain, so we get a little bit of acid in our rain water. That's also helping to break carbon out of rocks. And this reacts with minerals at the Earth's surface and it dissolves them. So minerals then come out of the rocks and end up in the water and get moved to different parts of the Earth, different spheres. So we also have this thing called precipitation of minerals. So those minerals that got dissolved into the water and carried around, they end up in the ocean. And then this comes out as minerals. Precipitates. So basically, you've seen this in science hopefully before, where you mix two liquids together and a solid is produced. That's a precipitate. So when this happens, sometimes it's happening in the ocean, and we're getting something called calcite or limestone. Like, we think of them as rocks, but they're really made of minerals. So phytoplankton, little tiny microscopic marine plants, use carbon and they make shells out of calcium, a mineral in the water. So the shells then go to the ocean floor when those little marine plants die, and eventually they mix with precipitates, the other minerals basically, and they form this rock we call limestone. And limestone usually has a ton of little fossils in it, so it's full of little shells basically. And this moves through the rock cycle because limestone eventually will get broken down, and part of that is soil formation, which we saw when we talked about this in the lithosphere. So that also releases carbon. Combustion, so rapid chemical combustion of a substance with oxygen. So anything that involves burning, right? We release heat, light, and also carbon dioxide when we do that. So this is one way that carbon is moved from the biosphere or lithosphere and into the atmosphere. So here's again your examples: burning fossil fuels, which would be taking it out of the lithosphere, and forest fires, which would be taking it out of the biosphere. So think this over by yourself. What are the 4 processes through which geologic carbon, this cycle interacts? Can you list them? And share your list and see who can list more. You might want to pause it here for this. And just to recap, the 4 that we talked about were weathering and dissolution, precipitation of minerals, burial and subduction, which we didn't really talk about, but that's like being buried down into the earth and then being melted basically and then pushed to the surface and forming new rock. Combustion, so anything that releases CO2. And the last one we also really didn't talk about, but it is volcanoes. Volcanoes release a lot of CO2 when they explode. So they are also contributing to that long process of geologic carbon cycle. Moving on to the biological carbon cycle. So short-term carbon cycle, this one happens more like hours, days, years, much shorter than the millions of years that the geological one takes. It interacts through the processes of photosynthesis, respiration, decomposition, and diffusion. So we'll see that. So photosynthesis. Green plants use solar energy to turn atmospheric CO2 into carbohydrates, sugar. So plants are so important because they're sucking CO2 out of our atmosphere, and they are turning it into oxygen. So plants breathe in carbon dioxide and breathe out oxygen. And we need oxygen, right? So, and we don't need CO2. So they're very important. Respiration, we can think of it as the reverse of photosynthesis. This is what humans do, or other animals, right? So basically anything that's not a plant is doing respiration, cellular respiration. So what we do is we breathe in oxygen. So if we go left to right here, that's still photosynthesis. Carbon dioxide, water produces sugar and oxygen. But if we go the other way, right to left, so we start at oxygen. This is what humans need, oxygen and sugar. And we end up breathing out water and carbon dioxide. Okay, so those two things are the exact opposite of each other. So humans really depend on plants and vice versa. So, a little bit more about respiration. How can carbon get back into the atmosphere through respiration? How does that happen? Plants break down sugar in order to grow, and animals eat the plants or plankton and break down sugar for energy. So we have a little thing here, oxygen, and then us and this cow breathing out CO2. Okay, decomposition. Carbon also goes into the soil as dead plant matter or dead animals. It's broken down by microorganisms during decay. We talked about this in the lithosphere. We also talked about it when we were discussing the permafrost. So this decomposition releases carbon back to the atmosphere. It also does that through respiration as well. So organic matter originates from a living organism, and it has hydrocarbons in it, and buried over time, we've seen this as well, forms deposits containing carbon, but we know them as fossil fuels, so coal and oil, and natural gas. So here's the plants at the beginning, and over time that layer gets buried down, and here we are drilling it millions of years later. So this releases carbon to the atmosphere through human consumption. Diffusion is where carbon, is absorbed and released where the ocean surface meets the air. So the ocean sucks in a little bit of carbon dioxide just from the atmosphere on its own. So, you have something to do here. Explain the steps and what's happening in this slide. So, what is happening over here in this picture? Step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4. It doesn't really matter where you start stepwise, but make sure that you have 4 steps there and that it shows a cycle at the end. You might want to pause and give yourself some time to do that. So here is what you needed to be able to do. Can you interpret how the carbon cycle flows through the atmosphere, lithosphere, biosphere, and the ocean? So how does it work? How does carbon flow through these 4 spheres? What are some of the ways that it does that? I have also created you a comic assignment, and that goes with this lesson. So it's what you're responsible for after you're done your questions in your workbook. And in the instructions of the comic, I've broken down movement of carbon through the 4 spheres for you, so that would be really useful to keep. You can basically include it as parts of your notes. So that should be available to you, if not today, then in the next class. And now you have an assignment and a test to prepare for. So make sure that you review all of your things. Hope that you've kept them organized. And remember that if you need any help, please go before your test, not after it. Study, 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 and you will be fine. We'll see.